If you want to make things that make things better, have fun doing it, and learn to help yourself and everyone around you flourish, well, you've come to the right place. Welcome to Enliven. This is the show where we explore what's possible and the people, the principles, and the practices that are going to help you build enlivening products and enlivening organizations. I'm your host, Andrew Scottsko, and my guest in this episode is Amy Edmondson. Amy is the Novartis Professor of Leadership and Management at Harvard Business School, specializing in the areas of psychological safety, teams, and organizational learning. She's recognized as one of the top 10 thinkers on business and management globally. Before entering academia, Amy worked as the chief engineer for visionary architect and inventor Buckminster Fuller. After that, she became fascinated by the interaction of people and systems thinking, leading to her work on organizational change and eventually to earning her PhD at Harvard. A globally sought-after thinker and speaker, Amy is the author of 6 books, including her 2019 award-winning work, The Fearless Organization. That's a book we go deep on in this conversation, and which I highly recommend you get a copy of if you're interested in this topic. In this conversation, we cover a lot of ground. Among other things, we talk about the anxiety that people perceive in the workplace and in school and how to relax around it. What was it like to work with Buckminster Fuller, and why, in his words, we don't belong to ourselves, we belong to the world. We clarify several key misconceptions about psychological safety and missteps putting it into action. We talk about the wrong ways to build psychological safety, and hint, a psychological safety initiative is not the way to go about it. Also, I tried something new in this episode and included several questions that I sourced from the audience. So if you send in your questions or comments about what you're interested and curious about to connect@enliven.fm, I can work them into episodes or also get back to you with what I'm learning along the way. So without any further delay, please enjoy this wide-ranging conversation with Amy Edmondson. Amy, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for taking the time and being here. It is a real privilege to have you with us.
Oh, Andrew, thank you for having me.
Amy, yeah, you said 2 things. I've heard you say 2 things elsewhere that I just really loved, and I thought it would be a great place to start. And one was that resonates deeply with me and really the mission of this show, which is really, as a show, this is an exploration of how do we make things that make things better, right? How do we make organizations that make things better? How do we make products that make things better? And then what does it take for people as, caring leaders and people in the world to actually do that? That's what this show is about. And so there was something you said, I heard you say that we all yearn to develop and express ourselves in the service of something greater than ourselves. And there was another phrase I heard you say elsewhere where you said, you don't belong to you belong to the world. And I was just hoping you could expand on that a little bit and tell us what that means to you.
Well, on the second one or the first one?
Whichever one's resonating.
Well, the second one, I have to cite the source, although the source is Buckminster Fuller, who said, you don't belong to you, you belong to the universe. And the point of that statement is that, in many ways, it takes the pressure off, right? It's instead of having to worry so much about who am I and am I good enough and am I sort of accomplishing enough, you can relax a little and just say, I have a role to play in this grander scheme. Mm-hmm. Now, the context for Buckminster Fuller saying that, which was in the late 20s, was a moment of great despair for him, where he had felt that he was in his early 30s and he felt he had made a real mess of everything. And let's see, 60 years later, I worked for him as his chief engineer. So this is how I got my professional start. I mean, my first job was a very strange job. I worked as an engineer for a boss who was 4 times my age, who had a grand sense of excitement about life and what each of us could contribute. So it was a very, very great way to start one's career, I assure you. So let me be clear. So in this period in his early 30s of feeling like a failure and that he'd let his family down and let his wife and his wife's family down, he contemplated taking his own life and says he was struck by a very profound sense of insight, of almost an external voice saying, you do not have the right to do away with yourself. You don't belong to you. You belong to the universe. Now, the insight there was, you might not know why you're here, but you're here for a reason. And the particular, and I think this is true for all of us, the unique experiences that you have had can and must be translated into something meaningful going forward, right? You might not be in the best position to know why you're special and why you have something to contribute, but rest assured you do. And it takes the pressure off. It's not necessarily, it's up to you to be here and look forward and want to contribute, but it's not up to you to decide whether you're good enough to be here. You are.
By virtue of the fact you're here.
Exactly. And you're unique. And there is Nilofer Merchant talks about onlyness, which I think is very much along these same lines. It's that each of us has a sort of unique role to play. And the more we can find what that is and not feel like a cog in a larger system, the better off we and the larger system are.
Wow. I love that. Thank you, first of all, for sharing. I'm so curious. You originally, the source, as you said, was Buckminster Fuller, but what was it like working with him? I mean, you worked with him, right? I love the story where you effectively just wrote him a letter out of the blue and he wrote you back with a job offer. But tell me a little more about that. Like, what was that actually like? Do you remember your first day working with him?
I do very much remember the first day because I showed up in the Philadelphia office and I didn't know it at the time. Bucky was there, and he had a small office. There were about 7 people who worked there, and he was there, and I didn't realize at the time how unusual that was. I mean, he just traveled a lot. He traveled 3 weeks out of 4, maybe more. He was in the office 3 or 4 days a month at most. So I didn't realize that I'd just gotten a little bit lucky. I showed up and there he was. And he didn't have a clear sense of what he wanted me to do. His executive office manager, the person who really ran his life in the office, didn't know what to do with me either. And so very quickly I was making photocopies. Now that's the kind of, that's the kind of task that ages me because nobody makes photocopies anymore. Now everything's PDF or we print it or whatever. But back then there was a lot of work in a lot of offices of making photocopies. And, so he was writing a new book and I was photocopying the manuscript to go to someone else. It was really boring work. So it was motivating to quite quickly try to get into doing something a little more interesting.
I love that. By the way, actually, one thing I wanted to ask you, I love that your moniker in this chat. So instead of you wrote self-disciplined astronaut, did you write that or did it auto-generate?
I didn't. I don't know where. I thought that was you.
I thought it was you.
I just don't know where that came from, but I love it.
I was like, what a cool moniker.
But it's also Bucky. I don't usually talk about Bucky anymore, but he called us all astronauts on Spaceship Earth.
Exactly. Right? I was like, I was thinking maybe it's a Bucky reference.
Yeah, and self-discipline. He also had his self-disciplines anyway.
Well,
it's
amazing. The spirit of Bucky is with us.
Yeah, I might keep it. I might have to keep it.
Here, I can screenshot it and send it to you. That way you have hey, look, I am in fact a self-disciplined astronaut.
Yep.
So there you go. The spirit of Bucky is alive and well and with us.
It's official.
With us now. It's official. What a fun coincidence. I'm curious, you must have had such a range of experiences working with him. When you reflect back on that, what has stuck with you, do you think? Whether it was a lesson from him directly or just something you took from your time there, what do you carry with you?
I think, in many ways, I think that's an easy question for me because the meta lesson, which was loud and clear, I mean, not on the first day, but almost, was the experience of being trusted to do some of the most important and central work. So within a pretty short time, I was doing engineering drawings and calculations for the development of new geodesic solutions for simpler geodesic dome configurations that could be larger without exponential complexity. So I'm doing that, and I'm doing that with a calculator and a pencil and various things, because it's right before personal computers came in, and nobody's overseeing my work. I'm just doing it. I can see if it works when I build things. I give the work to Bucky periodically. He's always very pleased with it. And he treats me as if I'm a genius, which I'm not. But it's an amazing experience to be told, in a sense, you're being given very important work, and then to be appreciated for doing it, to be trusted, to be without real oversight, with coaching and guidance, but no oversight and control, if you will. So it led me to experience and then almost take for granted that work is a place where you learn and grow, where you feel good about what you're doing, where you believe that what you're doing matters some small way to making a better world, where your colleagues aren't frightening. In fact, they're the opposite of frightening. They're interested in what you have to say. They're appreciative of what you do. I got to control most of my own work. I mean, I got to just decide in the morning what I would get done today. Right? So I work incredibly hard. So that little list that I just said is really what I think work should be like. What I think work can be like.
I love that, right? It's such like, what if the vast majority of workplaces were like that? I mean, holy crap! Like what could be possible? I don't even know, but I know it's extraordinary.
Right. The trust, the respect, the sense of mission, absolute intrinsic motivation. I basically started this job not knowing if I'd be paid or not, figuring out I'll do something on the side. I'll figure it out. I had to. Yeah. I mean, he was such a hero. I really wanted to be there, but within a few days, I learned I would be paid, which was good. Not very much. I was paid, very little. And I didn't care at all.
That's the best, right? It's like when the money's an afterthought, you're like, the money is great, but that's not why I'm here. I
saved money. I mean, I had a bicycle and a bunch of roommates and a nice house in West Philly. I mean, it was what did I need money for? Nothing.
Sounds awesome.
Yeah.
We'll move on from Bucky here in a minute. But I'm curious, was he intimidating at all? Like, I just imagine showing up, I might feel so intimidated.
Yeah, you might, but no, he would immediately. You might show up feeling intimidated. I certainly did, but within 3 minutes, he would have had you off that and onto something else. I mean, he was just he was joyful. He was appreciative. He was cheerful. He was always sort of interested and curious in what was going on and what other people were bringing. So I also the sideshow here was also this idea that here's a man in his late 80s who's perhaps the most joyful human being I've ever met. Right. So that was a new thing. That was a new possibility.
Yeah, like holy crap! Look at this. Yeah. Here's someone flourishing for a long time.
Yeah, and such a it's just so full of love and excitement.
I love that. That's so cool. Well, thanks for sharing that. I really appreciate it. Working where you work, right? Working at Harvard. One of the things you said right in the beginning of this conversation that really struck me was this idea. It came out of that quote of you don't belong to you belong to the universe or to the world, and this idea that you can relax a little bit. Yeah. And I was just imagining that seems like it seems like a really positive influence that if I was a, high stressed type A grad student at HBS would probably be a really good thing. And I'm curious if you notice that being an especially needed set of guidance for people these days, whether at Harvard or in where you engage outside of Harvard.
I do think so. I think an awful lot of young people starting out in various careers are deeply anxious, understandably. I mean, it's not necessarily a character flaw to be anxious. I was anxious, but anxious in a way that creates a sense of loneliness, right? Because you can't let your guard down. You can't let your mask go aside. And that is a vicious cycle. It's counterproductive because that anxiety can so easily be lessened with a few small things, sort of a recognition you're not alone, that everybody pretty much is in the same boat, feels like you do, so that I think sometimes that a feeling of connectedness is the most important thing you can have in the workplace. The sense of, I show up, I work hard. I'm anxious sometimes about making a deadline or doing great work, but not about my colleagues, not about being found out.
Yep.
Right? When we first logged on today, we had some problems with the technology, and at one point you said, "Oh, it was all my fault. I did something wrong," and I, jokingly said, "Oh, that makes me feel so much better because it's usually me." But there is it's always in good humor, but there's a way in which we're so afraid to be found out or to be less than perfect in any way, rather than just realizing it's funny and fine. When we screw up, we're going to do it. To err is human, right? That's going to happen, full stop. So get over yourself, right?
Yep.
Relax. And it's so much more fun to be curious about someone else and what they bring than to be tense about being found out.
Yeah, I could almost stop the interview right now, except we have a lot of other cool things to talk about. But absolutely. Do you think that's why this struck such a chord in the last year? I'm curious if you noticed it, like, why do you think your timing was basically perfect with this book? And I'm curious, did you plan it? Was it luck? Or what do you think? Why did this strike such a chord right now?
I don't know really, but my best guesses are that there's that people really have, we have finally recognized that we do knowledge work, right? That even in the most routine tasks, it's usually knowledge work, and knowledge work means got to use your knowledge, and that means we've got to be, and the knowledge that we use is in constant state of flux. So I think there's sort of a recognition that, wow, if people are holding back, if we're not hearing from you, if you can't bring what you know forward, we're at risk. So there's a kind of growing recognition finally that the pace of change and the reality of expertise and knowledge and uncertainty requires us to be a different way, right? It requires us to be willing to speak up, to take interpersonal risks, and that's not normal. I think also some of the less positive aspects of the workplace that have come to light over the last year or so, including the Me Too movement and various other corporate scandals and problems, have led people to be more aware that people are holding back an awful lot, and that it comes out eventually. Right? So what are we doing wrong? How are we creating environments where this movie script is playing out over and over and over again?
Just to set a grounding for anyone who hasn't read the book yet. So the book is The Fearless Organization, came out last year. It is really a treatise in a very practical way about building psychological safety in the workplace. But I think it also is broadly applicable to families, to, volunteer organizations, to teams, to really anywhere you've got groups of humans collaborating to do something, or just live. Just to set a baseline, I've heard you describe it as psychological safety, that is, as sort of not getting tied up in knots about interpersonal risk. How do you like to describe it for people now? And I guess related to that, what is it not?
Oh, great. Well, I like to describe it because I think it's conveys what I really mean as a sense of felt permission for candor. I just look around and I feel like this is a place where I can be candid, where I can ask for help, where I can say, oops, I made a mistake, where I can say I don't know, where I can suggest a wacky idea, right? That's and it just feels possible, right? It feels easy. So so that's the best I can do, I think, to define it. And yet, even when I do my best, I will still inadvertently imply, people will think, oh, it's about being nicer to each other. Like, no. And the reason I'm not against being nice, but the reason why psychological safety is not about being nice is that oftentimes, at least at work, being nice is code for, I'm not going to tell you what I really think. I'm going to go along. I'm going to nod, but then in the hallway, I'm going to tell my other colleague who I trust and like what I really think. It's also, I also want to say it's not sort of touchy-feely. It's not absence of conflict. In fact, if you really get this right, it's the presence of conflict. I mean, we're going to disagree. We're going to have different views. We're going to sometimes have to really get into it. It's not permission just to whine. Like, okay, now that you're psychologically safe, you can just sit there and whine about what you don't like around here. I mean, that might be fine and come along with the territory, but that's not what I'm talking about per se. And it's not nirvana, right? And it's also not the goal. The goal is learning or excellence or contribution for the mission. And all I'm saying is that if you don't have this kind of climate where permission to speak up feels easy, then you won't be able to do the work as well.
Yeah, no, I think you said that very well. And it went to how we actually originally came and got connected was I had some misconceptions of my own about what did this term mean and what is the psychological safety thing. And
right.
I think I had two really critical misconceptions that I have heard now from other people as I've been talking about this, getting ready for this conversation. And the first one was that it was the same as belonging or a sense of fitting in, right? And really, as I explored it, it seems like, and feel free to please correct me where I'm getting this wrong. It seems like this is really about voice. It's about candor. It's about the conditions that provide a easy opportunity to speak up about anything work related. I think there was a reference you used a lot, or a phrase you used a lot about any work related idea.
Yep. Work relevant. Yep.
And I thought, oh, wow, that's very interesting because you're not saying, or I think you're not saying it's about anything on your mind or about, what you had for lunch 2 weeks ago or your random personal hobby.
Right.
So say a bit more about that because I think that there's something there.
I think it's so important to realize I'm not talking about just unleashing every thought that flows through your head. Whether that sounds fun or horrifying is up to you. I'm talking about work relevant information. So if you suddenly feel all your colleagues should be interested in what you had for lunch today, you need a second thought. And this is in fact where the discipline comes in. I mean, I think psychological safety is the sense of freedom that I can bring my full self forward, but I also have an obligation to be thoughtful and disciplined about what I bring forward. Now, it's okay to err on the side of inclusion. Like if I'm not quite sure that something's relevant, I probably should check, right? But there are many things that are obviously not relevant and not helpful for the here and now. And so learning and engaging and sort of contributing to the shared work is a process that requires both a sense of psychological safety or discipline, right? Sort of discipline to get it right and to be thoughtful. There's been a lot of talk recently about courage, and people are, and I'm all for it, right? Starting to write about courage and courageous cultures, and the immediate questions that come to mind are, okay, well, if you have a courageous culture, does that mean we don't need psychological safety anymore? Yeah. Or if you have psychological safety, does that obviate the need for courage? And I think the answer to both questions is no. That in fact, I think psychological safety and courage are two sides of the same very valuable coin, right? That it's no matter what, there will be things that are going to be challenging for me to say, or I'll worry that I won't get this quite right. So I need to sort of, screw up my courage just a little bit to jump in there and try. But meanwhile, there will be, you can easily imagine workplaces where I don't care how much courage you're just not going to do it. You're holding back. It doesn't feel appropriate. It feels that it's not your place, etc. So whether you think of this as a need for more courage or as a need for more safety almost doesn't matter too much. I think the only real difference is that the emphasis in the term courageous cultures is on the individual.
Yep.
To speak up. You ought to speak up. Right. And the emphasis on psychological safety cultures is a little bit more on a combination of leaders, team and otherwise, and the collective. Like it's up to us. It's up to us to draw each other out. It's up to us to do what we can to make it easier for people to express themselves.
Yeah, I think the key word in what you said is easier, right? Not zero effort.
Right.
Or, so maybe it lowers the threshold or the bar of courage required, but it doesn't eliminate the need for guts.
Exactly. And in fact, I sometimes think about the question, it's a hypothetical question, but where do we put the threshold? Right? Where do I put the threshold? Because clearly you put it somewhere of what I will and what won't speak up about. And my primary argument is that most people, most of the time in most workplaces are putting the threshold for voice too high, right? They put it up here when it should be down here, not at the floor, but it should be lower than your instincts tell you it should be.
Totally. Right? Totally. Yeah, this is so useful because I think really going back to that belonging bit, one of the places where originally I and a few other people I've had conversations with about this got tripped up was thinking, oh, okay, psychological safety means we sort of combined the factors of being able to have voice and speak up about a work-related idea with the sense of I'm thinking of a good friend of mine, a sense of he basically didn't feel culture fit. Let's put it that way, right? Whereas like this person felt safe to say work-related things, just didn't really feel like I'm in the right place, right? A sense of tribe, for lack of a better word. And it's like, oh, those are just different things, right? And one doesn't invalidate the other.
Right. Right. In fact, you could easily imagine the possibility of 4 conditions, right? One with low on both, one very nice place to work with high on both. Like I feel like I really am, I belong here, I fit in, I'm included, feel psychologically safe. That's kind of the type, that's the kind of workplace most of us want.
Sure.
But you certainly can imagine a place where I absolutely feel my voice is welcome, but this isn't really my tribe. I don't feel people are like me, or that this is a place for people like me. That's okay. We could also imagine a place where if you look around and you sort of say, yeah, this is a great deal the type of place where I belong. And maybe you just feel overly nervous or anxious. You don't want to screw it up. So you either because of cues in the environment or because of what you tell yourself, you don't feel psychologically safe to voice.
Yeah, right. You see that a lot with groupthink, I think, right? Where it's this sense of almost like, you fit in so much that it might even be harder to be have psychological safety because you're like, well, I fit in so much that if I risk something, now I'm actually more at risk because now I might get pushed out a little bit. And, that fear of exclusion runs deep in humans.
You bet. Absolutely. And so it's faulty thinking in a way because I don't want to disrupt the harmony of this marvelous in-group. So I won't say anything dissenting when in fact your colleagues might be assuming that if you had something dissenting to say, you'd say it and that's how you'd add value. And you might be the only person who sees some real important risk that's not being discussed and you hold back for fear of disruption.
It reminds me of the story in the book, I think, about the exec who was afraid of being I think it was the phrase was a skunk at the party. Was that the right phrase?
The skunk at the picnic.
The picnic. Yeah.
So he's a senior executive, relatively new to the executive team from the outside. The team is discussing an acquisition, a planned acquisition. Doesn't sound like a good idea to him. but as he said, he didn't want to be the skunk at the picnic. I've used that example to convey the idea of a frame too, because sometimes I talk a lot, and I talk in the end of the book about the job of leaders, and meaning anyone can be a leader, but the job is to deliberately reframe reality so that we can be more learning oriented. But it's a good illustration of, what's a frame. A cognitive frame is it's a structure that through which you see reality, largely, unaware. But if you think about it, framing an executive committee meeting as a picnic is wrong. Yep. Framing a dissenting view as a skunk is wrong, right? And it shapes the behavior. It led him to hold back.
Yeah.
And I think he held back because he had the wrong frame. Right? The right frame is you're a smart, and by the way, more objective colleague because you came from the outside.
Yeah, you have fresh eyes.
Might very well see something, you have fresh eyes. That's a nice frame. Who might see something important that others have missed. And it's your job to share it, right? A very different frame.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So one of the things I want to sort of shift now that we've got a bit of a theoretical foundation here, and we got psychological safety. We know what it is now that we're talking about. I want to talk a little bit more. I want to explore a bit more territory, which I think is what, if I understood from some of my research, where you're looking to now, which is really about like the action. How do you put this into action? How do you make this real? The tools, the techniques, et cetera. And I thought it would actually be fun and I'm just especially curious to hear how you actually do this. So I've heard you say elsewhere that I think you said how we teach is what we teach. And I'm curious, how do you go about creating this environment? What do you do in your classroom with your grad students, or when you maybe engage with a company outside of the university?
Both, in fact. So how we teach is what we teach primarily refers to at Harvard Business School, our very heavy reliance on the case method. So the case method involves everybody reading the same case, which, by the way, the case itself doesn't have a lot of analysis in it. It's a pretty factual telling of a particular managerial situation, and we convene in the classroom, and the professor starts to ask questions, right? And I would call the questions good questions, according to the following definition, which is that they focus on some issue, right? They don't just say, "Hey, what's on your mind, Andrew?" They say, what do you think our protagonist should do, right? So they focus on a particular issue. They give the person room to respond. They invite careful thought. And so in the process of, over a class session, asking good questions, I am hoping that students will internalize the art of the good question, as well as the content or the frameworks or the various other things that case is designed to teach. And if that can become habitual, for managers, even for members of any team whatsoever, habitually to act as if, because that's what I'm doing. I'm acting as if, which of course it's true. I'm genuinely interested in what you have to say. I ask that question, and then I listen, and I look like I'm listening. And I'm hoping by doing that others are doing the same thing at the same time, and that they're thinking and ready to respond, right? So I should then be able to turn to anyone, whether they expect it or not, and say, "Hey, what do you think of what Andrew said?" So that sort of you're teaching a process of being curious. You're teaching a process of following the dialogue, of being interested in what others have to say, of being expected to react to it. Not just say, "Yeah, I agree," but to say, "It's an interesting point, and I wonder about this," or "I completely see it differently," right? That's the class is more fun. In fact, sometimes I have to
you gotta stir the pot a bit.
deliberately say, because if I just say, I call on you, you say something, I then randomly call on someone else, there's a 50-50 chance at least, and sometimes it seems higher, that they'll just build on what you said and agree. And sometimes that's happening 3 or 4 comments in a row, and I have to specifically ask the question, who has a different view?
Right? Call out dissent a little bit.
Right, because I'm asking for a narrower set of hands. I don't want just any old hand. I want only hands who are, willing and able to speak up with a different view. So another thing about how we teach is what we teach is, good questions, good listening, building, going somewhere, and ultimately ensuring diversity of voice, right? Diversity of opinion, diversity of expertise, sort of ensuring. So I'm doing, it's important to do that anyway, but I'm not always doing it just because the case needs it. I'm doing it because that's what we're trying to teach. That what we do takes process help. It doesn't happen. Groupthink happens spontaneously. No problem. It will happen, but really good conversations, they take work.
Yep. That's so, yeah, I love that. It's interesting because I spend most of my time, like, I love the podcast, but it's something I do as sort of a, an out loud learning journey as someone who spends the vast majority of his time really trying to apply these ideas, mostly in the world of technology and innovation. That's where I spend, 95% of my time. And it's really interesting as I'm listening to you, I'm sitting here thinking, okay, how might this be brought into those types of environments, right? Into, say, I work in product development. So when we're, beating our heads against the wall on solving a new problem that we don't know how to solve, how does this help? And I think I was curious, you talked about the leader's toolkit on, I think it's page 159 in the book, where you talk about setting the stage, inviting participation, and responding productively, sort of a, a before, during, and after.
Three categories. Yeah.
Yeah. These sort of three buckets of actions that a leader can take, before, during, and after, what you're doing. Right. And, I was hoping you could maybe walk us through an example of whether that's, if you want to talk about maybe Mulally and what's happened at Ford, how, like, what did that look like actually to set the stage and the frames like you were describing, and then to actually move into the activity and then to sort of loop through this cycle?
So I was, this is sort of an aside, but I was speaking at a conference at Stanford with sort of women business leaders in the area, and I was telling that story, and this one woman commented. She said she used to work for him, and she said it's Mulally. I'm like, okay, like Valley. Okay, it doesn't look like that in writing. So anyway. So I'm like, great.
Mulally. Okay, got it.
Mulally, right? I still work on that. But when Alan Mulally came in from the outside to lead Ford was bleeding red ink. I mean, it was the company was in real trouble.
Right? Do you know what year this was?
Oh, I want to say. I should look it up, but I want to say around 2007, but it might have been it's probably a little earlier than that, actually, because when
September 06.
06? Okay, so it's not that bad. So 06.
Fall 06.
Fall of 06, and 3 years later, they were the only one of the big three automotive companies in the U.S. to not need a bailout. Right? I mean, so they went from being probably worst performing to being best performing. And when Mulally took over, he didn't sort of change out the whole team. He inherited a senior team, and he brought them together, and he introduced a kind of traffic light shortcuts for how we talk about what we're up to, where red is bad news and yellow is caution and green is all is well. Mm-hmm. And as he tells the story, first couple of executive team meetings, everything's green, right? Mm-hmm. And so finally he turns around and says to the team, listen, he says, we're on track. We are on track to lose $30 billion. Now that's a B dollar. It's a staggering amount of money, right? We're on track to lose $30 billion this year, which, by the way, I think is a pretty good example of setting the stage. I mean, he's essentially, in a way, making it permissible to say, yeah, we're in trouble. Like it's, we can't be doing everything right and losing $30 billion. So
it's just not possible.
Right? So something has to be wrong, right? That's kind of like table stakes. I'm setting the stage. And then he says something like, is there anything not going well? Everything's been green. And that's also invite input, invite engagement. He's reaching out and saying, tell me what you're seeing out there that's not working. And as the story goes, there's a deathly pause. And finally, Mark Fields, who is head of all of the Americas, raises his hand and proceeds to describe a very serious problem with the new Ford Edge, new vehicle launch. And it's got serious production problems, and they're kind of accumulating work in progress, faulty inventory. And the stunning thing about the story is that everybody else in the team reported later to a Fortune magazine reporter that at that moment their thought was, okay, he's out of here.
Oh, they thought he was about to get fired.
They thought he was about to get fired. Like, they literally thought he would get fired for speaking truthfully to power.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
Which is crazy in a volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world. It is crazy that anyone would think that way. Maybe 100 years ago you could run a company that way. Maybe. But clearly that's not going to work in today's world. There will always be things that aren't going well because none of us have a crystal ball, and there's so much complexity and uncertainty. So, what happened instead of being fired, of course, was that Mullally, in that moment, put his two hands together and started to applaud. And he then said, and that's a symbol, right? That's a very powerful symbol of appreciation. I just applauded. And then he said, Mark, thank you so much for that clear line of sight, which I love, because I think it's mission critical to express appreciation. And notice it's not Pollyanna talk, right? It's not happy talk. It's not, oh, that's great. No, it's not great. I mean, this is a serious problem, right? Yeah. But so it's an honest statement. Thank you for that clear line of sight, because a clear line of sight is always a valuable thing. And then almost, without a pause, he says, now what can we do to help? Right. So to me, the essence of a productive response is that it's appreciative and forward looking. I mean, there is very likely a need for a postmortem, right? There's very likely a need to take a look at what happened and why. Not now, right? The most important thing to do and say right now when someone has brought bad news forward or a concern is to say, how can I help? Right? What should we do?
Yep.
And then stunningly, within about the next 12 seconds, 3 executives spoke up with ideas of how to fix it, with offers of engineering talent to send up to the plant. I mean, it was sort of remarkable that one moment of courage on the part of Mark Fields, but inviting engagement on the part of Alan Mullally, they were off and running. Like,
that was the moment it turned.
The problem-solving process was now underway. And so I also like that story for the following reason. Oftentimes when I start talking about psychological safety and more voice and more candor, people have a worry, which is okay, I get it. I can see why it might be productive, and it's going to take too long, right?
This is going to take forever, Amy.
It's going to take, meetings will take forever. So I like to say 12 seconds, right? And then step back and think, how much time was wasted because that problem was not reported?
Yeah.
Right?
How much time did we spend dancing around it?
Yeah. How much time is wasted day in and day out in meetings around the world, dancing around issues, not being truthful, not being candid? And I would posit that time wasted is much higher than whatever time it takes to actually get to the bottom of it and start to come up with solutions. And I want to remind people that problem solving is a team sport.
Yep.
We're rarely able to solve really tough problems on our own. Problem recognition is something we're pretty good at. Like each and every one of us are good sensors. We can see problems. But we need our colleagues to help solve them.
For sure. To the concern that people have raised to you, right, about like, how long is this going to take? Or is this all going to be touchy feely or whatever, right? It seems like then there's always the question in the back of people's minds, especially in the business world, of like, well, why is it worth it, right? What's the ROI here?
Right.
And it seems like one way, overly simplistic, that I would answer that question, just listening to the story there about Ford and Mullally, is it seems like one of the things it enables you to do is that psychological safety. It enables you and everyone here to play to win instead of playing not to lose.
Oh, that's exactly right. That's exactly how I think about it, because playing to win is kind of, let's go for it.
Yeah.
We might get bruised and scratched along the way, but we're going for it. We're all in. We're not, and when you're playing to win, you're not caught up in, how do I look? And, what do people think of me? You're going for the gold, right? You're going for the prize, and collectively. Whereas playing not to lose is a very natural state, a very natural psychosocial state, which is, I'd rather not fail, than take the risk of really going for the win, right? So playing not to lose is, okay, I don't want to make a mistake. I don't want to step outside the bounds. And when you play not to lose, you generally succeed in not losing, right? You get your goal accomplished. Like, you don't lose. You don't look bad. You kind of manage impressions carefully. But you lose out on the opportunity to go after the bigger win, the opportunity to do something new with your colleagues that required you to sort of bravely jump in. And
yeah, it's almost like you've reduced the spectrum that you're willing to tolerate to this very like safe, narrow zone. Safe in like air quotes, right? It's not really safe. It just feels less risky. It's like you don't want to tolerate the feeling of anxiety, vulnerability, whatever. But as a result, you traded away the lows, but you also traded off the highs.
Exactly.
Do you notice any parallels, or does it come up at all in your research? Do you find any parallels to the topic of self-compassion?
I haven't thought about that a lot, but with that term specifically. But as soon as you ask it, the answer is yes, right? Because part of what this is all about is self-compassion, right? I mean, I think it is about reminding yourself that you're fine, just as flaws and all, right? Yeah, you don't have to get every answer right in the classroom or have everything you do be perfect to be okay. I mean, you have to have that, have to be more generous with yourself and probably with each other as well.
Yeah, no, because I was thinking about, I came across the other day a book I read long ago, which is, I think it's called Self-Compassion. It's by Kristen Neff, who's sort of the leading researcher on the topic of self-compassion and sort of the intersection with that and mindfulness. And it occurred to me as I was prepping for this conversation, I was like, oh, it's interesting, because in the same way we're just describing psychological safety is almost like, it seems almost like an external version of self-compassion, right? It's like the set of conditions that enables you to be resilient and go for it, right? Because according to Kristen Neff's work, when you really have developed self-compassion, you actually you go for things more because you're able to bounce back, right? You can deal with it not working, right? And it just seems, that seems a little bit related, almost in like an inner outer way.
And it's also related to the growth mindset. That that sense that I don't have to get everything right all the time. I have to, in fact, keep giving myself harder challenges, in a good way.
Yeah, which then that idea of seeking harder challenges and finding one's sense of self-esteem in the act of being a learner, right? Almost it's interesting as I think a lot about, and I talk to people a lot on this show about, human performance and what are the factors that unlock it. And it's funny, just as you said that
Mm-hmm.
idea of escalating, laddering up challenges, it almost seems like, well, there's your link into flow. There's Csikszentmihalyi's work right there.
Absolutely.
Because without that, like if you can't ratchet up challenge and go for that ride, you can't actually sustainably have flow in your life.
Right. And it's that, the flow state is that state you can't be in the panic zone, right? But you don't want to be in the comfort zone either. You want to be in that zone where the magnitude of the challenge is well balanced against the capacity you bring to do it. But you realize you can keep developing that capacity. You can keep getting better at something.
Totally.
And you can only do it by being willing to take that risk. I also think the flow state is one in which you're less self-conscious. You might be self-aware, but not self-conscious. And that does relate to psychological safety.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. A future guest on the show actually is working directly with Stephen Kotler and all the flow research out there. And that they found that that's actually one of the key things that happens in flow is, oh God, I'm blanking on the part of the brain. I think it's the lateral dorsal prefrontal cortex, I think, something like that. Yeah. I will find it and put it in the show notes. But basically, it's the part of you that gets self-conscious and it just goes offline. It just knocks offline in flow, which is super cool. So it'd be really interesting actually to explore the link between flow, group flow, and psychological safety. That might be a fascinating area to look at. So as a thought.
I agree.
So kind of coming back around, one of the things you said early on that I thought was super important, and I remember bolding this in my notes to come back to, was this idea that I want to explore where does implementing this go sideways, right? Because I think most people who encounter your ideas probably like them, they want to do it, but I'm guessing they're not all successful in implementing it. And one of the things that I heard you say elsewhere was that it's not just about like doing a psychological safety initiative, right? It has to be in service of something. It has to be, formed around a goal where it's like, we're going to explore this together. And we don't know the answers, and it's critical. There is no blueprint. So we're going to have to figure it out together. And so I'm curious, what else do you see about where this works or doesn't work when people are trying to make it real?
Well, I think what you just said is the most important thing to me, is that, and of course I'm deeply sort of appreciative of and admiring of anybody engaging their organization in a psychological safety effort of some kind, right? I think that's comes from a good place and is a good thing to do. And I think it's, far, far, far more likely to be successful if the initiative is on the work, right? In other words, what is it that we are trying to do or be that we're not yet? We need to launch a digital strategy, or we need to turn our financial performance around, or whatever, something that's really truly mission critical. And then the recognition that we won't be able to do this unless people are able to sort of bring their full self to the effort. So then the journey and the change is being produced by working on the thing, working on the real goal, and using that work as the laboratory for also checking in on how do we become, how do we create a better climate? How do we take small risks? How do we, there's a kind of, chicken and egg problem here around collaboration and candor. It's like, which comes, you need candor to collaborate effectively, but you need to collaborate to have candor. And I think it's self-reinforcing, but you have to have some substance to really work on. And I think most companies are not going to have a whole lot of patience for sitting around and talking about psychological safety or any aspect of the culture.
Yeah.
Because that's not the business they're in, right? The business they're in is whatever it is. And then psychological safety is the servant of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it not only does it help your business, it actually helps everyone's experience in your business too. One thing I'm curious about, other than that, do you see any common failure modes? Are there any patterns you're noticing where this just goes sideways? Like one example that I could imagine is, and this is actually riffing from a listener question that somebody submitted. Let me find it really quick. There it is. So I'm going to read you this question, and I think it might be a failure pattern. I'm curious to hear if you think so. So the listener said, I've noticed a pattern where leaders who highly value niceness and harmony are talking about psychological safety a bit as a reason for not giving or wanting feedback, or avoiding addressing issues head on. I'm curious, how does Amy see the concept being misused or used in almost a shadow culture kind of way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really great question, and I do see evidence of that. I want to make sure to say I don't think it's deliberate, right? I think it's inadvertent. I think it's a failure mode, but not a malicious mode.
Yeah, not like a nefarious evil plan.
Because nice, a culture of nice can in fact mask a culture of fear. Because oftentimes in cultures, there's a lot of companies I've been in where they'll say, "Oh, we have, fill in company name here, nice," and it's so funny. Let's say the company's name is Edmondson, right? So they'll say we have Edmondson nice around here, and it's almost as if they think nobody else ever had that, And there's so many companies that have that same problem, and it's. They understand, when people tell you that, they understand it means we can't be disagreeable.
We can't be real.
Yeah, we can't be real. And what that means is they have framed or coded dissent or input as being disagreeable or even disrespectful. And in a nice culture, you don't want to be disrespectful. That doesn't fit with the nice culture. So it's a very real risk. And so I think it starts with making sure you don't fall prey to that failure mode is to be very clear and explicit at the outset that, this isn't about being nice, right? This is about, being passionate about the customer.
As one of my favorite coaches of all time said, she said, "Don't be nice, be great."
Yeah, right.
It's like, this is about being great, as great as we can be as a company, a team. Yeah.
And I used to say psychological safety is kind of a blend of trust and respect. It's a sort of, I trust your intentions. I think also your capabilities. And I respect you. I respect you enough to not hold back.
Yeah. It's almost like you're caring enough to say the hard things.
Right. Because if I don't care, if I'm indifferent to your future, then why would I exert effort?
Why pay the emotional tax?
Right.
You just skip it.
Right.
So I want to transition to a few more of some of the listener questions. I think there's some really fun ones in here.
Yeah.
So one that came up was, and I know that you cover this in the book on page 20, there's a scale, but it basically was, how do you measure safety? I know in your surveys, you talk about using like a 5 or a 7-point Likert scale. Is that what actually works for people who are operating a business, or is there another way that they can, if I'm a team leader, how can I tell if I have a problem or not?
It is the case that more and more businesses are using this survey. I don't think very many would do a survey just of this, but if they throw this into their all-employee survey, then they get some useful data. And one of the most, I don't think that data is useful for, it's not an end in itself. It's a mirror to say, okay, we should have some conversations. In every organization I've ever studied, the following is true. Psychological safety varies across groups. Right. So it's not a variable that's just uniform throughout a company like Ford or General Motors or you name it. It's this group and that group and so on. Now there might be differences in average across companies, but so to me, the important part about using the survey, if you're interested in those kinds of things, is to see where the gaps are so that you can help, right? So that you can go to those groups where they might need a little bit of help and turn them around. But I don't think you need to use a survey. In most cases, you can in your own team, for example, step back and ask yourself, how often am I hearing about problems and mistakes and concerns? And especially relative to successes or fine, all's well, right? So if you're not hearing the negative stuff, it's very unlikely that that's because things don't go wrong ever.
It's probably
right?
a red flag.
Right. So it's probably a red flag, right? You probably have to sort of get into some of these techniques like asking good questions and setting the stage and all of that. So that's one. If you're not, if most utterances are positive, you may have a psychological safety problem. If people seem just, kind of tied up in knots or a little bit too formal and not, there isn't a kind of, positive, warm sense of humor, and we're able to kind of laugh about ourselves. As you and I
Sure.
started this conversation, we laughed about getting the technology wrong and making mistakes, and neither one of us felt a need to say, "Oh, it couldn't have been my fault." But it's funny. But in real life, often people really don't. They do not want to be associated with a problem, a failure, a mistake of any kind. They feel that would be career ending, which of course is rarely the case. But so just force yourself to step back and ask those kinds of questions and say, like, what is, it's palpable. What is going on here?
Yeah. It reminds me of, oh gosh, what's it called? Kim Scott's work with Radical Candor, right? And where she gives advice to managers of any, place in the hierarchy of, like, when you're having your one-on-ones, for example, how, like, do people feel safe enough to criticize you, right?
Yeah.
If your direct reports never tell you, like, how you could do your job better, or have, never tell you the impact of things you did that didn't work, like, that's a red flag, right? If it's all sunshine and roses, like, no, it's not. Something's missing here.
Exactly. Yeah, it's the same thing. Yep.
A related question, in this idea that if we know we've got it right, if we can see that people are speaking up, they're using their voice in whatever ways are appropriate. I'm curious, and another listener asked about, does this differ at all, or how does it differ across sort of the introvert, ambivert, extrovert spectrum? Like, there are certain people or personality types that are just quieter, or less comfortable in certain situations. How do you think about that?
Well, I'll answer that in two ways. One is I do have some data that suggests that introversion, extroversion is not correlated with psychological safety, right? That there's an equal chance that you can be an introvert and an extrovert and be in a psychologically safe, environment or lack thereof at work. And the main difference, of course, between introverts and extroverts is the energy it takes, right? That if I'm an introvert, it takes more out of me to share. I get recharged by being alone and thinking and so on. And if I'm an extrovert, I actually get my battery charged by engaging. I almost have to think aloud. So it would seem like, but that's the energy thing is slightly different than the do I feel my voice is welcome thing.
Yeah.
So it may still be the case that extroverts are talking more. That doesn't mean they're more psychologically safe. And so that's sort of the data side of it. But it is a reality that some people need a little more space. And I think it's probably the case that introverts are going to be more dependent on the leadership practice that I describe as inviting engagement. Like if you ask an introvert a good question, that introvert will happily answer.
Yep. It seems like it would also be about having, if you're trying to create this environment and foster this environment, having sort of a number of tools in your tool belt for how to, for example, solicit feedback. So not necessarily expecting, you could ask for feedback in the all hands meeting, but an introvert is a lot less likely to speak up there, but having other channels where it's like, hey, a written forum or a one-on-one or something like that seems like it would let you to go more broadly there.
Exactly. I mean, the core emotion that psychological safety is about is fear or lack thereof. So I think what I hope is that people can understand that it may not look like it, but more often than not, people are afraid, right? They're afraid to speak up, right? They don't want to get it wrong. They don't want to look bad. They don't want to intrude. Now it's not big saber-toothed tiger fear. It's little interpersonal fear, but it can be crippling, and it is addressable.
A question that came up was about how this affects an interviewing process, right? A hiring process within an organization. What have you noticed there? Like, do companies need to change the way they're hiring to promote more psychological safety? And I know I'm asking you two questions at once, which is a terrible thing, but how should a company think about designing an interview process that will actually source people who are willing to challenge the status quo of a company? Like maybe a company is not that safe, but finding people who are willing to do the work to promote it, to their right, to their left, to the people below them, and to whatever extent they can up the hierarchy.
Are you saying how do we hire people who are able to help create this kind of environment, or how do we hire in a way that? How do we do interviews in a way that it's?
I see. Yeah, I sort of did ask both those questions. I think I was actually asking the latter more, but feel free to respond to whichever one's more interesting to you.
Okay. I think I haven't thought directly about either one before, but I think the latter question of sort of what can I do to bring people in who will help create a more safe rather than a less safe environment for all of us to collaborate. And I think that's a really good question. And it reminds me of the efforts they make at Southwest to kind of bring people in who are really team players, right? And one of the techniques they use is that they'll actually have group interviews. They'll have people come together, and they might and when they're in a team, in a group, and they're sort of having conversations and questions and discussions. One of the things they're really looking at is not what you're saying when you're speaking, but what you're doing and what you're like when someone else is speaking. Do you have empathy? Are you curious? Are you interested? Are you present? And so that might be, sort of the opportunity to observe someone more in situ with other people is going to be very valuable, I think. For understanding who's going to be a good member of the team. If there's a way to assess curiosity, and perhaps there is, if you're interviewing someone, do they have questions? Do they ask you questions about you, about the place? If they have no questions, now that could be fear, it could be, but curiosity, I think, is a fantastic enabler of psychological safety, because if you have, by and large, people who are curious, then you have people who will ask questions. And when you have people who ask questions, you have people who are indicating that they want to hear others' voice.
So here's one more, and then we'll kind of start to wrap up. One idea that is that, and I'm going to read you this question as well, because I think it's very well phrased. So different people have different life experiences, work experiences, family history, backgrounds, etc., all of which contribute to how they perceive reality, what is safe for them. And the question is really, what is universal about what makes people feel safe, independent of those varying factors, and how should you adapt your toolkit to create a sense of safety based on these differing needs?
That question, it's such a lovely question. It makes me want to go back to the beginning here, where you and I started by talking about this idea that everybody wants to work in an environment where they can be appreciated and be contributing to the greater good in some way. Mm-hmm. We all want to be a part of something larger than ourselves, and we want our unique gifts or experiences or skills to be put to good use. Mm-hmm. And so, I think that's what it's all about. Yeah, we're going to have differences. We're going to have different ways of expressing ourselves. We may need different things to bring ourselves forward. But if we start with the premise that this is what we all long for, then we'll figure out ways to get there.
Yeah, no, I love that. I couldn't agree more with what you just said. Actually, someone asked me once. This actually was at a thing I experimented, or a workshop I did near Stanford. And there's a group at Stanford that does a really great, it's a class, I think, called Designing Your Life. And they turn it into a really good book called, I think, also Designing Your Life. And there's a very interesting question in there where they ask you people to personally reflect on, what is work for to you? And I'm curious if this is totally out of the blue. Yeah. You're not prepped for this at all, but I'm curious, when you hear that question, what comes up?
I mean, to me, I don't want to be a broken record, but it's for making a difference. Work is for making a difference. And work is a forcing function for learning and growing. Mm-hmm. So work is both for me to make a difference out there, but also for me to get better, right? For me to get more, to grow. I mean, to become more capable and possibly more fully myself. I mean, if I'm doing fun or leisure, that doesn't require me necessarily. It depends on what it is, to learn and get better. There's some fun leisure things like playing golf or something where in fact you are forcing yourself or trying to force yourself to get better. But there's some things like watching a movie where you get to just watch the movie and enjoy it and relax. So work is for making a difference, and work is for developing your own abilities to do that.
Yeah, I love that. My answer was very, very similar. My answer was that work is a place we go, or a platform for us to develop and express who we are in service of something greater than ourselves.
Oh, so perfect. Did you say develop and express?
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah. Who we are in service of something greater than ourselves. I love that.
I never connected these dots until right now. That actually ended up being one of the foundational kind of ideas behind doing this podcast, was how do we make more organizations like that? Because I think, as you said, that's what, on some level, we all want.
That's what we all want.
I mean, we all spent majority of our waking hours at work, so
right.
That'd be pretty great.
Sure would. And not enough organizations are doing that as well as they should today.
Yeah, which is, back to your work, something I'm very grateful for what you're up to, and I definitely am trying to do my part as well with this show and the things we're building in the world. So we'll start to wrap up here. One question, and I'm sure you get this question a lot, and I apologize if it's trite, but if a leader's listening to this, right, they're bought in, they're like, yes, Amy, I'm signed up, and you could only have them make one change or take one action, install one new habit. Like one thing, what would you have them do?
Ask questions. Ask more questions, right? Just get interested. I wanted to say two things, right? It's go first. And by go first, I don't mean go first in sort of pronouncing truth, but go first in, doing the scary things like admitting a mistake or saying I got that wrong or saying I'm worried about this. So, that's sort of, if you want other people to do those things, you better do it first. But I think if I have to say only one thing, it's force yourself to ask more questions and, of course, listen to the answers.
You talked about how powerful it is when particularly someone in a position of authority, and I'm using that distinctly than saying a leader, because leadership is distinct from authority, how powerful it is when someone apologizes for not having made it safe in the past.
Yes.
Do you find that people it would seem that there can be a real, the word that comes to mind is healing process, that when that kind of openness, when that kind of space is opened up, that something new can emerge. Do you find that happening? And first of all, do you agree? And second of all, are you seeing that happen?
It's incredibly powerful. right? When someone says anything along the lines of, I am so sorry for what I did that put you in a position where you felt you couldn't speak up honestly to me, or fill in the blank, lots of other things. But to own the impact you have had, which was not your intention, right? But to own the impact and be willing to own the impact is, it can just unleash so much.
Absolutely. So a couple of rapid fire questions here. The questions are short. Your answers don't have to be.
Okay, good.
If you could go back in time, knowing what you know now, is there anything you'd change about this book or your previous books, since you've kept on learning based on everything you've learned since they came out?
In this book, I would do a better job of saying what psychological safety is not earlier on, right? So that no one could have that, it's about being nice, misimpression at all or for long. Prior books, Teaming, my book, Teaming, How Organizations Learn, Innovate, and Compete in the Knowledge Economy, is probably, I think it's a good book. I think it's a pretty good read. I think it's a little bit more academic than is ideal. Although it does have stories in it and so on.
Yeah. I'm actually in the middle of reading Teaming right now. And one thing I just wanted to say that I found, just for the listener and also feedback for you, that I found especially useful in there was you gave language to something I'd been trying to find the words for. Because I think if I were to summarize one of the big lessons I got from your work getting ready for this conversation was that context matters, like a lot.
Yes.
And there are principles here which is a lot of what you're uncovering, but the ways in which those principles are enacted matters tremendously and varies tremendously based on culture, location, power distance, fill in the blank variable here.
Uncertainty,
uncertainty.
The work. Are we doing innovation or are we doing production?
Yeah. And that was exactly the thing. There was something in there, I think it's called the knowledge process knowledge spectrum.
Yeah, it's process knowledge spectrum.
And I remember I was like, oh yeah, okay, this is helping me understand when to pull which tool out of the toolbox, because you have that idea of there's like routine work where it's super well understood. Then there's complex systems, and there's God knows there's a lot of those now. Yep. And then there's really discovery and innovative work or innovation type work where there are no blueprints, and the fact that these tools, the application of these principles varies across that spectrum. I was like, oh, okay, got it. So
I know it's like I could have had a debate. I mean, it's like,
duh.
It's so obvious, right? It's such a duh that I felt embarrassed putting it in there. But a lot of people have said what you said, which is that was like a huge source of, insight or clarity for them. So it's like, yeah, I know. I mean, I often found myself doing it in front of a classroom because of a question would come that would make me realize, I better step back and say, well, it depends. And just for instance, it depends on this. How much knowledge we have at this moment to get the result we want. Very high in the automotive assembly plant, very low in the pharmaceutical R&D lab, right? And it matters. Psychological safety is important in all three domains for different reasons, and it manifests in different ways.
Yeah, I learned this the hard way about 2 years ago when I took over a large product initiative that involved hardware and software and cutting edge machine learning. And we were trying to all three in one product. And we were trying to figure out a lot of really hard problems. And we realized very quickly, or I realized in about 3 months after beating my head against the wall, wow, my playbook isn't working. Like I have to throw out my entire playbook because something about it does not apply here. And what I eventually figured out with a lot of help and conversations and coaching was that, it's interesting. All of those plays were for a domain where the links between activities and outcomes are well understood. Right. And in this domain, that is not true. Like we don't know what's going to happen when we do X. And it's like, right. Okay. Duh.
Right. Duh. And yet there you banged your head against the wall for some period. Exactly. It's kind of stunning, really.
It's a thing. It's a thing. Curious, as you go through, you're up to a lot, and I'm curious. This is a question I like to ask everybody. What are some of the rituals, the personal practices, habits, routines, et cetera, that, enliven you, that nourish you, support you in doing what you do and making the difference you're seeking to make?
Don't have a good answer. I run. I mean, not very fast, but I do like getting out there, moving. I like also to be, to have time. I don't have enough time to sort of sit and think and scribble. I have to scribble. When I'm writing something, I often have to start with a pen and drawing lines and arrows between things, because it's hard to figure out what comes first. And if you just start typing, it forces it to be in some sequence that might not be right.
I'm curious. You seem like someone who really thinks in systems. Like, it seems like a lot of your work is really at the intersection of humans and systems.
It's true.
And I'm curious are you familiar with the work of a guy named Simon Wardley?
No.
So I think I'll send you the link after the show,
right.
But there's a guy named Simon Wardley who has a technique that, and I'm dying to get this guy on the show. If anyone listening to this has a connection to Simon, I would love to talk to Simon. Anyways, the reason I bring it up is he has what I consider to be a novel method for, I would call it almost ecosystem or strategy mapping is what he describes it as, in exploring the links between things and uncovering or sort of surfacing non-obvious connections. Put it that way.
Right.
And it came to mind listening to you of like, oh, wow, that might be an interesting tool for you as you're doing your work, exploring, as you're exploring into the unknown. I think you might think there might be something there for you. Absolutely. And I will send you that link for sure.
Great.
Okay. So one or two more and we'll just wrap up is, I'm curious if there are any, what was the last small change you made that had an outsized impact on whether it's your productivity, your sense of satisfaction, happiness, fun, whatever, but what's a small change in recent memory that has had a surprisingly big impact for you?
Oh gosh, two very different things came to mind. One is just turning off, using airplane mode when you're not on an airplane. It can really, it can help. That can help me think. And the other is just the resolving to be kinder. And I'm kind with strangers, but to be kind with family members. I think it's working.
Good. All right. That's awesome. I'm curious if there's any books, particularly recent ones, that have, whether it's an idea or a book you encountered or a thinker or whatever, just something like that really took hold in your brain and like impacted how you see things in recent years.
Leadership and Self-Deception. Do you know that book?
I do not.
Oh, it's magnificent. I mean, it's not magnificent in the sense of being great writing. It's magnificent in the sense of being great philosophy. It's one of these rare business books that's a novel. And the novel is telling, has a character who's sort of learning, how not to be a jerk, and learning that, many of the things that he's been blaming on other annoying people in his life, boss, wife, what have you, are in fact things that he's manifesting and creating. And it's got a sort of a wise character who kind of leads him through this journey of discovery, of how, in a sense, I suppose the quickest way to say it is how your own frame produces the results that you almost reliably are blaming others for, but that really stem back to you. And it's a very powerful book. I read it a few years ago, and then I read it again not so many years ago.
Okay, well, that's going on my reading list for sure. It reminds me, that last thing you said there reminds me of a question that there's a guy named Jerry Colonna, I'm not sure how to say his last name, who wrote a really good book called Reboot. And there's a question he likes to ask people in his coaching engagements, which is something to the effect of, how am I complicit in creating the conditions I say I don't want?
Exactly right. It's exactly right.
So I think it's a really good question. That goes in your category of good questions.
It does. It does. And it's not one that people are going to easily be able to answer, because the first instinct is not at all. Like all the bad things out there are out there. So it can take a little bit of work to get to a good answer.
For sure. For sure. So what's caught your attention lately? What are you reading, thinking about lately? Now that the book is out, you've got a little space from that. What's top of mind now?
Yeah, well,
maybe you don't. I assumed you did.
I think top of mind is getting more concrete, useful tools and techniques and ways to help people practice and make a difference in their own workplaces.
Perfect. I love that. So is there anything we didn't cover that you wanted to say?
No, I mean, what was great about this conversation is it really did, as you promised, take us in entirely different directions. I don't think I said anything that I've said before, right? So that's quite a big
mission accomplished.
Because I didn't want to, it's good not to be just a tape recorder.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. So just in wrapping up, are there, for the people listening to this, is there any asks you have of the listener? Anything, if they're listening and they want to help, they want to engage, what would you ask of them?
It's read the book and then go take it, talk about it with your own team, your own work group. A lot of people ask, well, wait a minute, I'm not the boss, so can I do anything? And the answer is a resounding yes. There's so much you can do just by expressing interest in others and listening carefully. You have the opportunity, a dozen times a day to give someone else a moment of feeling safe to engage.
Absolutely. That's beautiful. And where, if people are curious, where can they connect with you, with your work? Is there anywhere you would direct people online or things like that?
Well, I do have a faculty page on the Harvard Business School website, and that shows you things like what I have written and what I'm up to in terms of general research aspirations and so on.
Perfect. Well, we will put all of that in the show notes. So, Amy, thank you so much for the time. It has been an absolute pleasure, and thanks for coming on and sharing your wisdom with all of us. It's a real pleasure.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us on iTunes. That helps us reach way more people and build this community up. For show notes, links to the resources, and everything else we discussed, please go to enliven.fm. Feel free to reach out with questions, feedback, or just to say hello by emailing connect@enliven.fm. Be sure to subscribe, and until next time, my friends, leave them better than you found them. We'll see you soon.